Good afternoon. Thanks for coming. Welcome to manage delivery of your app via DevOps. I don't know if you guys have heard, there's been some issues with certificates and stuff. So this is like really exciting for me and also incredibly scary because a couple of the sessions before this, the demos have failed and things. It's an Azure problem that I think they tell me is fixed. So I've got a ton of demos on my presentation that I'm going to get through, I hope. But if I don't, I might switch to video. So just a heads up on that. All right. Okay, so let's start out with some session resources. Feel free to take a picture here. There's also the same slide at the end of the presentation as well. I should mention, my name is Brian Benz. I'm a cloud advocate at Microsoft. Unless you don't like the presentation, then I'm, no, just kidding. It's been a crazy day. So we're going to talk about what is DevOps today, just to get everybody up to speed and on the same page. We're going to talk about people, process, and products, and that'll be more clear as we progress. And then I'm going to demo. About half of the session is a demo of DevOps in action. We're actually going to take a change in an application on my local machine. We're going to push it to GitHub. That's automatically going to take that change, push it to an Azure DevOps project, which is automatically going to do a build and a release, and then the release is automatically going to build two different websites, a staging site and a production site. And I'm going to ask for some audience participation at the end as well. So have your phones ready. There's a little bit of an A/B test thing we're going to do and see how everything worked. All right. So this is a great example. I'm going to show you a quick video. It's about a minute and a half. But I think it's a great example of how the world has changed and actually is very, very specifically tied to DevOps and to IT projects these days. So let's get right into it, and then I'll show you the rest.
But Holland comes in for a pit stop. Time to refuel and change tires. Lou Moore himself changes the tires. Only 4 crew members, including the driver, are allowed to work on the car. It's a tense time. Holland stays in his seat, anxious to get away. Let's watch.
Just take note, there's very few people allowed to access the vehicle, and each person has to do things in parallel. And it still only takes about a minute, 57 seconds. However,
the tires are changed at last. A crewman polishes the windshield as Holland moves away just 67 seconds after he stopped.
I don't think the windshield needed all that attention, but anyway, that's what I would have fixed. Here's how things have changed. There you go. That's IT projects these days in a nutshell, as far as I'm concerned. There used to be acceptable limits for releases. You could do a release every quarter, every half year, every year. A monthly release was really, really frequent, but that's not really the case anymore. The demand these days is daily releases or more frequent releases anyway. Also, more people have access to production than they used to. More teams are working on things, all hopefully in sync, but as you can see, there's all those people touching the car at once. There's a lot more potential for things to go wrong. So how do you actually allow people to access the vehicle like that to get the speed that you have in the second example without actually having everything fall apart completely? And that's where DevOps comes in. And that's the same thing for IT projects these days. So what is DevOps? This is a great quote by a colleague, Donovan Brown. DevOps is a union of people, process, and products to enable continuous delivery of value to your end users. Keep in touch, just keep in mind value. That's the real goal of all of this. It's a lot of work to set up a good DevOps infrastructure. And if you aren't providing value from that infrastructure, there's really no point. And the key to that is people, process, and products. This is a report that comes out every year by a group called DORA. They're actually purchased by Google now. DevOps Research and Assessment is what that stands for. And they interview high-performance DevOps organizations to find out what the key is to their success compared to people who might have no DevOps or a starting DevOps implementation. And this is what they found for 2019. 208 times more frequent deployments. Now, if you don't have a good DevOps system, that probably scares the heck out of you, because 208 times more DevOps deployments, how can you actually keep track of all those? But if you notice, interestingly as well, they have a 7 times lower change failure rate. So they have less errors and way more activity. There's 2,604 times faster time for incident recovery. So if something does go wrong, and things go wrong, they can recover 2,604 times faster than someone who has no DevOps or a simple DevOps system or infrastructure. And this is the most important one to me, 106 times faster from commit to deploy. What does that mean? That means that you can actually focus more on the features and make sure that you're actually delivering that value to your end users rather than focusing on the infrastructure and the actual process that you need to go through to get that code from commit to deploy. So the key to all of that really is people, process, and products. And we can talk about people first. If you've got a situation where you've got the dev team, they're saying, hey, this works on my machine. Ops, just make it work. Don't tell me any of the problems you're having. And the ops team is saying, hey, you gave us this thing, but it doesn't scale, and we need your help. And they're really not talking to each other, just throwing things over the wall at each other. You're going to have a lot of problems. So that's really the main key. Now, how do you actually get the people to work together? Well, there's process. So making sure that everybody understands their roles. And you have, between the planning, development, test, release, and delivering things to production, making sure that everybody communicates well. Monitor and learn is often overlooked. That's one of the most important things, though. How do you actually know that the thing that someone asked you to build was actually built in the end? It's something that is trickier than it sounds. Someone asks for a feature, it goes through the planning phase, it gets passed to developers, the developers make their own interpretation, the release people actually release it, maybe it doesn't work exactly the way it was supposed to, or it might not be performing as well, but now it's in production. So you need to have a monitor and learn process that is at least as important as the other processes, and it's quite often overlooked. So how do you actually get the people to work together and get the processes implemented? Products are key. So you should have products that support your infrastructure and your people to make sure that you can actually run through the life cycle of a software development project successfully. And the products we have, of course, at Microsoft, we have GitHub, Visual Studio Code for our developers. For operations, we have monitoring, policy, compliance management, also automation and security. And then for delivery, we have Azure DevOps and GitHub extensions and GitHub Actions. And that's actually what we're going to focus on today. So let's talk a little bit about that. So delivering with Azure DevOps. What is Azure DevOps? For those of you who might not be familiar with it, Azure Boards is like Kanban boards. We actually have a facility for you to be able to connect through GitHub and or Azure DevOps to our Azure boards, which allows you to communicate between the planning and the developing phase and deliver that to the release phase. So planners can go in here and see what's being developed, what stage it's at, if there's any issues with it, and the developers and the release people can get back to the planners and with questions. Everybody can communicate basically through Kanban boards, which is a great facility. Azure Repos, we have Azure Repos. I'm sure most of you are familiar with GitHub repos. These are not GitHub repos. These are actually separate. We have both. And I get asked often, what is the purpose of Azure Repos if you have GitHub repos? I don't know if you guys heard, but Microsoft bought GitHub a while ago. And we've done a lot of different things in GitHub. We've made private repos free. And we've got really, really good integration with our other Azure DevOps. But the answer to the question of why do you still have Azure repos, they're really, really useful for working within your domain. So if you have a project, and most people do, inside your organization, 100% inside your organization, and you want to manage identity, people who have access to that software and release lifecycle, you can do that through Azure Active Directory or whatever identity management system you have inside your organization. GitHub has ways to do that too, but it's a little more complicated. And GitHub is really, really good for projects that you might be collaborating with outside contractors, or an open source project that has multiple people outside of your organization contributing to it. So that's kind of the difference. So Azure Repos is great for in-domain projects, and GitHub is really good for projects where you're collaborating with people inside and outside your domain. All right, pipelines is actually what we're going to focus on mostly today in my demo. Pipelines are a way to deploy, to build actually, and deploy. We manage and support Linux, containers, Mac and Windows. We have staged environment releases, and we have built-in deployment approvals that are linked to your identity management system in Azure. And I'll show you that a little bit too. We also have native support for containers and Kubernetes. All right, a couple more things. We have artifacts, so you can manage artifacts, you can manage releases, you can share code efficiently by the original source code or binary using artifact management. It keeps track of your versions, and it's actually a really handy way to keep track of all the different versions, and if you have to, roll back. Also, we have test plans. Test plans are a way to do load testing and also web testing, web forms, et cetera, et cetera. You can capture really rich data, and it integrates with your monitoring and learning as well. So it's a great way to do testing before things are released to production, and or integrate with monitoring to make sure that when you actually put things in production, it meets the requirements that you had when it was originally developed and released. On top of all that, we have GitHub. I mentioned before, we bought GitHub. It's the premier social coding. I believe there's 40 million, I heard in the keynote, 40 million now developers on GitHub. It's just a way of sharing things across enterprises and inside your organization as well. Not much more to say about that. Everyone's pretty familiar with GitHub. Azure DevOps, we actually have integrations in a couple of different ways. We have GitHub Actions, which you've probably heard about a lot at the conference. We also have GitHub Extensions. And I'm going to show you GitHub Extensions today because that's an easy way to connect your GitHub repo to your DevOps projects. So this is the fifth session in a series, the MOD series. So this is MOD50. And we've been going through a life cycle of a fictitious company who started on-prem and moved their applications in the first session. In the second session, we moved data. In the third session, we showed you some integration with cloud services like serverless and things. And that, by the way, was where my session screwed up. I delivered MOD30 as well, and there were all kinds of problems with it. We're trying to get, if you went to MOD30, I'm trying to get a repeat of that. There were some certificate issues that weren't mine. I was glad to hear, but only in a certain way. But anyway, and then MOD40 was tracking monitoring and performance. And now we're actually adding a DevOps layer onto the application. So that's where we're at now. And we've got the Dev and Ops team working together. And here's some of the things that the Dev and Ops team can do to work together and that they're processes and product support. For dev, of course, they provide code, unit testing, and they have a GitHub repo that we're actually collaborating on. And they help with CI/CD automation via some YAML files. Ops team actually provides the Azure DevOps project that the dev is going to use to manage the DevOps through build and release. Ops also provides the web servers. They provide scaling. CI/CD automation, they help with that as well because they know the infrastructure better than the developers do, so they sort of collaborate on that YAML-based CI/CD automation that we have. And then monitoring and security, of course, is provided by Ops as well. So the scenario we have here is we've set up a DevOps project, and it's the weekend. It's coming up on the weekend anyway. It's just a few hours before closing on Friday, and someone's popped into the dev team's office and said, you know, we really want to have a test of our shipping. Right now, our shipping is, let's see. This is the Tailwind Traders website. You can see here, right now, the shipping is set at free shipping for $99 or more orders. And they think that's too low. They think that if they bump that up to $250, it won't affect sales. It won't actually affect sales. People will still go for it, and they'll pay for shipping below $250, and we'll get a better margin on our sales. But they said what we want to do is we want to do a test. Is there some way that we could just test some of the people to see if it affects sales? And of course, because we have a good DevOps system and we're using Azure, we're actually running this on an Azure web app, we say, yeah, sure, we could do this thing called A/B testing with deployment slots. And half the people will see the $250 for shipping, and half the people will see the $99 for shipping. So he said, yeah, okay, great. You know, can we do that before the weekend? You know, it's a couple hours to the weekend. And of course, because you have a good DevOps system, you say sure. So that's what we're actually going to do in the next 20 minutes or so, is we're actually going to implement that from start to finish. Okay. Okay, so DevOps in action. So the first thing we're going to do, actually, is I'm going to go into Visual Studio Code, and I already know where the code is. It's in this translation JSON file, and I'm going to change this to $250. Great. Okay, so we're done. For those of you who work in dev, I know this isn't a real example. You'd probably have to change some back-end stuff too, but for now, we're just changing the description. And we're going to watch that flow through to production. Let's pretend that just changing that description would actually change the real shipping cost behind the scenes in all the calculations. All right, great. So now I'm on my local machine. I just changed this file, and that's changed the shipping cost. Well, now, how do I actually get that in production? Okay, so next we go to our ops team and say, hey, you've been telling us all about this great DevOps system you built and the projects and things. We want to try it out today. We've only got 2 hours, so what do we do? And the ops team says, great, we've got a few things for you. We've got a project. We've got a few things set up. Here's what you do. So we're going to actually go into GitHub. We're going to go into the site where this code is sitting, and we're going to use Marketplace. I mentioned GitHub extensions, so we go into the Marketplace, and we search for Azure Pipelines. Okay. Search for Azure Pipelines. All right. Okay. So Azure Pipelines is the GitHub extension we use to connect GitHub projects to Azure DevOps. So I'm going to click on, I've already installed it, so I'm just going to click on Configure Access, Configure. And what this does, I'm still in GitHub, but what I want to do is I want to choose this select repository, which is my BBen's Tailwind Traders website. Make that a little bigger for you. And I want to save that. So now what it's going to do is it's actually going to take me into Azure DevOps, because I've instructed GitHub, I want to work with this repo, and I want to connect it to Azure DevOps. So it asks me for my credentials for Microsoft. And I go in, I have a project, an organization that has been provided for me from the ops team, and a project. And the project itself is called BBen's Tailwind. Okay, so I can just use that project. I don't have to create a new one, but you can. I can create a new organization and a project if I want to. All right, so now we're actually in Azure DevOps. See over here on the left, Azure DevOps. And now we want to tell Azure DevOps what to do with this repo. So we know that we're working with a fork, we're working with BBen's Tailwind website. And what it does, when I actually click that, Azure DevOps analyzes the code and decides what kind of application this is. But actually, this application, the Tailwind Traders website, if you've seen any of the previous demos, it's got some Node in it, it's got some Java, it's got a bunch of other things, but the main thing is .NET Core. So it's given us a bunch of different options here for things that we can use as a base template. I can pick ASP.NET Core if I want, but actually what I've done, the ops team, let's go back into that repo, here it is. The ops team, once again, has provided me with a YAML file that I can use. And this meets their base compliance needs for any application like the one we have. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to paste this in here. And I'm going to do save and run. Save and run is going to do a couple of things. It's going to actually commit this YAML file back to my GitHub repo. And from now on, my GitHub repo and Azure DevOps will be connected together via that YAML file. Or I can create a new branch and just use that branch. But this is a really simple application. I don't have a lot of developers. It's just me right now. So I'm just going to commit to the master branch. And when I do save and run, it saves that file, it commits it to GitHub, and it runs a build in Azure DevOps. There we go. We'll just wait for that to be queued. And then I'm going to move into releases. Because this takes about 6 minutes to run. Like any good developer, I know how long it takes to actually build this thing. It does a bunch of things that I'm going to show you after. But while that's building, let's go into releases. I'm going to show you how to actually create a release. So when we're done with the build, we're going to connect these two together. So the first thing I do is I just say create a release. And there's a bunch of templates here as well that I can choose from. I'm going to choose the Azure App Service deployment because we're deploying to an app service. Well, there's tons of other options I could use for the base template, or I can start with an empty job and configure my own release, depending on how complicated you want to get. In this case, it's a demo and it's a simple release, so we can just go here. Staging is our first thing. So we're going to create this first stage called staging, and we're going to select the target for our staging. So it's going to be my subscription. It's going to be a web app on Windows. We do have web app on Linux and a few other options you can choose from. And then you can have a website called BBen's Tailwind Staging. So the app service, once again, the ops team has provided us with our target web apps. They've already built these. They have scaling built in. They have everything that they think we're going to need for this application for staging and production. So it's, once again, the tools are allowing ops and dev to work together. Dev just uses the actual facilities that ops has provided them. All right, so I'll save this. I'll go into the pipeline. So that's staging. So now this artifact, when it's built, is going to deploy to staging, but we actually want to go to production as well. So what we can do there, I just hit the little clone button here. Pretty straightforward. I can call this one production. And we want to change the job. We don't want it to be staging anymore. We want it to be production. All right, so we'll save that. So now we have a pipeline that's going to go from staging to production. Great, okay. However, Well, I talked about an A/B test before with a deployment slot, if you recall. So the other part we need to do is we actually need to set up that deployment slot. Where's my, here we go. So here's my production web app. If I go into deployment slots, once again, the ops team has already set this up for us. It's really nice. We've got a Tailwind production deployment slot, and we've got a Tailwind Canary deployment slot. And how those work behind the scenes, if you look here, the traffic is designated as 50/50. The web app, actually, if I go into just the Canary deployment slot, you can see here, the normal app is https bbens tailwind production.azurewebsites.net, and it adds that -canary in there for the A/B testing deployment slot. The users will never see that. Anyone visiting the website will only see the production site, but half the traffic will be siphoned off to this URL. And technically, they're in the same app service. So how do we actually set that up? We go back into our release. Where is it? I lost it now. There we go. OK, so we're going to clone this again. And we're going to change this. We're going to call this Canary. OK. Then we're going to change this task. So deploy Azure App Service. Before we just changed these, it's very simple just to point to production or staging. This time we want to go into the actual app service deployment down here. And what we do is we say deploy to slot. Then you choose the slot you're going to deploy to. Oh, sorry. First the resource group. And then here's the deployment slot. And we have production or Canary. We're going to change it to Canary. All right. And we're going to save that. OK. All pipelines. Whoops. Stay. It's not saved yet. All right. There we go. So now we've got staging, Canary, and last but not least, we'll just change this to, say, production. Great. All right. Now, I don't think it's a really, really good idea, and I don't think many people do, that you would, once you make a change in GitHub, it would actually just flow all the way through to production. So luckily, we've got some facilities we can use to actually stop that from happening. We've got post-deployment conditions and pre-deployment conditions. So the first thing we're going to do is set up a post-deployment approval. And I'm just going to put my name in there. There I am. OK. And that's enabled. So basically, from now, it's going to flow through staging to Canary. It's going to stop here. And then I can release it to production. But the production team might have a problem with that. They're the ones who control production. So what we do there is we set up a pre-deployment approval. And once again, it's just going to be me, because I'm the only person up here. There we go. All right. So now we have this can be deployed. Once the test is done, everybody's happy with it, the dev team can say, let's put that in production. The prod team can then say, we want to put that in production too, but not now. We want to do that later, and you can actually schedule that using the pre-deployment condition. There's a whole bunch of other automation options for the pre-deployment condition as well, through these things called gates. You can actually do things like analyze your source code to make sure there's no vulnerable open source packages, or something like that. That's all automated through here. And that can be multiple stages as well. So you can have the physical approval from someone and or the automated approvals as well. Now, don't forget to save this. I do sometimes forget to save it. OK, so that's our staging. We've actually got our releases set up. Now we actually need to actually check out the artifact. Let's see what happened with the build. Hopefully it built. Yep, see the little green check mark. Everything's there. It actually built. So I can go back into my releases now. And I can go to the new release pipeline. And I can edit it. I can add an artifact. And I can choose the artifact that we have from a build. I can also choose one from Azure Repos, GitHub, TVFC. I can go from Jenkins, and I'm going to talk about Jenkins a little bit later. Azure Artifacts, a whole bunch of different ways I could actually do this. But we're just going to go with the simple one, which is the build we just did, and I can choose the latest build. I can choose a specific build. I can choose the latest one from a different pipeline, because you can have multiple different pipelines. In this case, we're just doing the simplest, which is the last build we did is going to do the very latest, so every time it changes, it's going to do that. Okay. So we save that. And then we can create a release. We don't want to actually create the release yet because we haven't changed the code yet, if you notice. I didn't push this to GitHub yet. We still have one change. So the next thing we want to do, now we've linked those things together, we've built the pipeline, we actually want to trigger this and have it run. All right, so the first thing we do in Visual Studio Code, I can use the GitHub pull request extensions pipeline. I can just say, oh, actually, did I change this yet? Yeah, I did. Okay, just want to make sure. It's been a while. Change shipping to 250. Okay, we'll commit that. Oh, staging commit it. Then we'll do a sync. And that sync will actually push it up to GitHub, and it'll trigger another build, which will build the release for us. It's taking a second to push. There we go. All right, let's check out our GitHub repo. We should have a pull request. Oops, sorry. The code, we should have commit, not a pull request. Okay, so, there we go. Change shipping to 250. So it's actually triggered that build. So if we go into Azure DevOps, and look at builds, and there it is. So it's triggering the build, and then it's going to go through release, and then we'll ask you guys to do a little bit of audience participation to do that change once it's all gone through. It'll take it another few minutes. Okay. So while that's cooking, I want to talk about keeping your investments. So some of you might be using third-party tools. As I mentioned before, we got plan and track, you got develop and test, you've got release, and you got monitor and learn. There are a lot of different products that support these facilities that Microsoft doesn't build. However, we work with all of these people so that we actually have integration with them. And I'm going to show you some of the integration we've done with Jenkins for this as well. How many people here use Jenkins for anything? Okay, yeah, it's usually about half, so that's cool. So Jenkins is really, really good at building, and it has some release facilities, but they're not so strong. They're not as strong as Azure DevOps release facilities. It's really used for build and test most of the time. And some of you are probably saying, yeah, we do releases via FTP or file share or Dropbox or whatever, but there are better ways to do it. So what we've done is we actually work with Jenkins. And let me show you how we work with Jenkins. ci.jenkins.io. This is a live site of Jenkins building Jenkins. It's running on Azure, and it runs through, it actually runs through a partnership that we have with them. So every time there's a pull request that comes into the Jenkins project, for those of you who might not be familiar with Jenkins, it is probably the world's most successful, largest open source project. It's written mostly in Java, and they have a lot of activity for pull requests, for commits, for issues, and they manage all of that on Azure through ci.jenkins.io. You guys can check that out yourself. And over here on the left, you'll see some things that they're actually using. They're using Azure container instances. Let's see, there's an Ubuntu VM running. There's usually some Windows VMs. Yeah, there's the Windows. They're offline right now, but they're waiting. Oh, there's one Windows 2012 server. So what I'm showing you here actually is when a pull request comes into the Jenkins project, they have multiple versions of Windows, Ubuntu. They run it on containers. They run it on Kubernetes. They test the heck out of all the pull requests before they actually start considering them for implementation in the core product. And they actually do the build of the core product through here as well, and distribution. So it's kind of a cool little example. Then a lot of things have come out of it. We have, for Jenkins on VMs, we've produced Azure architecture. We also have a Jenkins for containers. And we have a ton of plugins that we've built in partnership with them as well. So we actually are one of the companies, I believe we're the only company who actually has a staff that builds Jenkins plugins that allow you to work with Azure. All the other plugins for the other cloud providers are generally community driven. And that means that they're built if a certain product wants to promote their product, but not necessarily maintain for the good of the greater community like ours are. And it's part of the partnership that we've done because we recognize that people have huge investments in Jenkins. And we're not asking you to give up those investments, but we are asking you to consider Azure DevOps for doing some of the things that you might not have facilities in Jenkins to do. All right, so before we get to that, let's just check out our build and see where we're at. Okay, the build just finished. Let's look at the releases. So this should have triggered a release. All right. It was just a second ago, so it might have been a little bit. I forgot oh, thank you, yes. Thank you, sir. Man, someone back there wins a prize. I did something stupid. And it's magnified because I'm on stage. Great. I need to edit this release. And look at this. I forgot to click this little box, which is a continuous deployment trigger. And that would actually make an automatic release when a build is done. So let me save that again. And I will just create a release anyway. Create a release. So normally that would be automatic, but I didn't do it. So there we go. So this only takes a minute. While this is cooking, let me show you one more thing I have to show you. We still have 7 minutes, so that's cool. But thank you for that. That would have taken me like a minute or two to figure out. And then, okay. So the other thing I want to show you is, I've been showing you Visual Studio Code. We actually have, these are the pull requests for actually VS Code. So I have 190 commits for my application. These guys have a little bit more. This is actually Visual Studio Code on GitHub. It's open source, so we take pull requests. We do follow issues. We have 3,665 issues for those. Let's see how many are closed. Yeah. We're still working with a lot of them. October 2019 endgame, that's for the release of Ignite. But we have a ton of pull requests here. And when those pull requests actually run, it runs in Visual Studio Code. So each one of those pull requests, when we do a commit, will trigger a build and a test in VS Code, and then we have our own distribution system behind the scenes for that. So we're actually using our own code. We're dogfooding, as you should, and we're actually using the same extensions I just showed you here now for Visual Studio Code to trigger releases, builds and releases in Azure DevOps as well. All right, so let's go back to our DevOps project. Hopefully it's done. Yeah, let's see, release 1. Okay, so it's gone to staging, it's gone to Canary, and now we're ready for some audience participation here. Okay, so I'll just ask you guys, what's going to happen is when you hit this site, half of you should see the old site, which I haven't moved to production yet, and that should have a $99 price on it. Half of you should see the $250 shipping. So go ahead and hit that site. I'll give you a minute. And, well, a few seconds anyway. Okay, so quick show of hands. How many people saw the $99 site? Okay. And how many people saw the $250 site? Yeah, about half. There you go. So it's 50-50. I can show you the site up here. This is a problem. This is why I do this. I can actually show you this site up here, but once I show you one of these, it's always going to go to that one. So, Tailwind Traders Canary. Come on. There we go. So this is my Canary, so I get 250. Now if I go back to production, it'll show me 250. You know why? Because it has sticky sessions, so whenever I go back, it's going to do that. Okay, so that's it. Thanks for that participation. Appreciate it. So quick review. We talked about what is DevOps. Talked to you about people, process, and products. Showed you the DevOps in action, and also showed you how you can keep your investments. We have plugins for Chef. I didn't mention, but plugins for Chef, Puppet, all the other tools that you use for working, and you can enhance those products' functionality through working with their facilities to integrate with Azure DevOps as well, and Azure. We have a Docs alert, Akka MS. We have a resource center for DevOps. We have Azure DevOps Docs. We have an MS Learn modules that you can use from start to finish to work with DevOps, and it also ties into certifications. And speaking of certifications, we have a free certification exam. You guys have probably seen this by now, so it's day 2. But feel free to sign up for that. Upcoming sessions. So this is the end of the mod session where we showed you from start to finish everything to do with moving your application to the cloud pretty much as is. We moved from on-prem to a website and implemented DevOps. Apps, starting with Apps 10 at 3:30 tomorrow, is actually going to show you how to do the same process but containerize the application and then put it on Kubernetes and then track it using tools that are really good for working with Kubernetes for monitoring and security. There's a few others here as well. Applying DevOps to data science is going to be a pretty good one. AIML. Break 4012 is exam prep. If you want to, we actually have DevOps certifications, so we have exam prep for that. And there's a theater session on how Microsoft actually does DevOps, and I wouldn't be surprised if they talk about the VS Code example that I showed you there. Once again, those are resources. And that's my time. I'll be at the back of the room. Well, I'll come over here if you have any questions. So thank you very much for coming.